It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Raymond Moody, and we're going to be discussing his book, God is Bigger Than the Bible. Raymond, I always look forward to speaking with you. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you so much for bearing with me over these difficult few months for us. And I'm just so looking forward to this. Thank you.
Well, truly my pleasure. We were supposed to talk back in the summer, and here we are finally knocking this interview out before we cross into 2023. Previously, we've talked about some of your books related to near-death experiences, your book about nonsense, and you also have this book that I found on Amazon called God is Bigger Than the Bible. And to some, it might feel like a weird left turn from some of your other material, but I'm curious for you in terms of kind of that story behind the book. Like what sets you down the path of putting this book together? What was that journey like?
Well, as you know, Shaun, my family wasn't religious. And I mean, at least after I left home, they started going to church and then backed off from it. But, and it was the reason was, as I had to figure out when I grew up myself, my dad was kind of hostile and sarcastic about religion. To me, it was part of the landscape, right? But as I grow older, I figured out he was, get this, a medic in the Pacific Theater in World War II.
Wow.
And imagine what he saw at the age of 20 something. Okay. And, now I understand why, that just soured experience, all the things. He told me only one thing. That group didn't talk, but, one thing he did say, he had to cut a guy down who committed suicide. I mean, just like horrors. And so because of that, I just, I didn't, it wasn't like I was an atheist or anything. It was that I just didn't think about God. I was focused on God's theater, which is the stars. I was an astronomer and just wrapped up in that, wonderful experiences of gazing through telescopes and so on. And so I went to the UVA at age 18 to intending to major in astronomy, which was since I was 8. But when I got there, I mean, holy mackerel, I took a philosophy course and I was hooked. And then reading Plato's Republic in the first few days of college is where I discovered these near-death experiences. And that book was the very first person, Plato was the first person that I ever knew who took it seriously. I remember a great Jack Benny movie my aunt took me through in the early 50s, I guess, and it made the afterlife sort of a comic premise. I thought it was like a comic fantasy and the cartoons, and that was my attitude. And so then, oh my God, this amazing guy takes the question of an afterlife seriously and then talks about these near-death experiences. Then, I was intrigued by it as something from Greece, but then I heard of an actual case. My dear beloved friend and mentor, George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at UVA when I was an undergraduate. And one of my philosophy professors told me that George had had this experience where he'd been pronounced dead for at least 9 minutes. They knew at least 9 minutes, no heartbeat, but he had this astonishing experience. And I listened to him tell about, oh my God, that was the first time that I consciously was aware of God, I think, I mean, in the presence. But there was one other time when I was 11, but I just, what was that? And then I realized, oh, that's what that was all about. And so anyway, it didn't bring me into a belief in life after death. There's no way of making a logical inference about that, but it awoke this just astonishing quest. And I've interviewed since, thousands of people over the years who've had these astonishing experiences of life after death. And so it was mostly through hearing these people talk about their encounters with God that woke that up in me, right? And And then I had like a personal experience. I mean, it wasn't like figuring out, oh, this is real, but like, oh my God, this is he. And at a time of turmoil, um, pitying myself as I look at it now. And but anyway, I learned about that thing about kneeling. I'd always thought that was kind of vile for people to think that they can kneel to God, what, to flatter him, or and that's the sense of a ritual. It's ridiculous, right? But I saw about the kneeling because what happens is you can't stand up. I was sitting in the chair and I just melted like into a pool of mercury on the floor. And it's William James talked about these kind of experiences. You may do something to trigger them, or all I did, except being grieving or just all bad off. But whether you do or not, it just comes on you that you experience it passively. There's just no way to. I mean, and also no way of describing it, just like William James said. And so there I was. And well, I mean, and another thing, a lot of people over the years, Shaun, have asked me, Raymond, do you believe that God exists? Yeah, and you've heard that question today. It's like, but I can honestly tell you that my answer is absolutely not. But hold on to your hats because you think of that sentence, I believe that God exists. Well, isn't it, Shaun, the obvious reality that I'm Raymond Moody? Any belief I could entertain about God would be defunct or, vaporized. And in the meantime, if you think of that sentence, the emphasis is on the sentences and the word exists. Not on God, right? Raymond, do you believe that God exists? Right? And I tell you this, as you know, I was a philosophy professor. I taught logic. And as a logician, we could sit together. It'd take about 30 minutes, but I could go through and I could explain to you what the concept that something exists means, like what it means to say that, and also to how to put it into symbols and work with it. But when it gets to God, I give up. It's amazing to me. People think they can do something by taking that limited human concept, very definable, of existence, and trying to clamp it around God. It makes no sense. But the people, the musings they worry about, it's, does God exist? Well, that's not the right way of putting it. The right way, I mean, to me, not right, just for me, is what I say is I have a relationship with God, you know? And I mean, that says nothing about existence. The human concept of existence is the relationship that I experience, not just just now constant. It's been, as you probably know, it's like over the years, this becomes more and more part of yourself. And so I think what God is all about is about relationships. And so that's how I have come to this stage in my life. And I found in my process that I used to pray to God to, I make up my Christmas list. I send it to God, and I thought that was prayer. Okay, and sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. But the more George Ritchie once said to me, I've been through this spell. I always decide to do something, I commit to do it. Then I just, oh my God, it's just like it's too much. And then, oh, I'm going to kill myself. Not kidding, just kidding. But, no. And then, I finally just say, oh, I turn it over to God. And then it usually vanishes. Yeah. And that happened to me one time. And it's the first time I remember it happening. And the next day I saw George. I explained what happened. And he said, surrender is the most powerful prayer. And that's what I've learned. If I start on something without, talking about it with God first, it's gonna, get me into a storm of distress pretty quickly. However, if I think about it beforehand, I ask God to guide, lead me on it, it works. Yeah. Realized that years ago where every time I've ever lectured, just maybe once in a while I've, in a hurry I've forgotten or just didn't do it, but it's my process or my procedure for years before I give a talk. I always pray about, all right, God, you guide this, lead and guide me to say things that will help people, and so on. And that always makes it better.
Well, Raymond, what I've always appreciated about your books that I've read and our talks that we've had is you, with the way you describe things and share how you've wrestled with things and reached conclusions. You always stretch me and challenge me, and so I've loved that about your work and our conversations.
Thank you for
I,
the questions, Shaun. Thank you.
Well, so one of the things I wrote down in my notes from this book, you say it's strange how many people cannot keep God and the Bible separate in their minds. What do you mean by that? Because to some people, they would be really offended by that statement. Yet, on the other hand, I kind of feel like you're with what you just described. You're drawing on an experiential and a relational kind of interaction that you've had with God, and for you, that's been a huge part of informing you about what it's like to be in a relationship with God. Somebody from a Christian perspective would come and say, "Hey, the Bible is kind of what defines that for me." And so they would struggle to say those two aren't one and the same thing. So what do you mean by that statement? It's very provocative.
Well, I mean, it seems to me, just by thinking through it, it's like God, as I appreciate God, it's like this vastness of, the most recent star count, most accurate star count is about 150 billion trillion. And as a very minimum, it's almost all of them have planets. Let's say it's 4 planets per system. That means 160 billion trillion planets. About 1 in 1,000 of those, at least from the Kepler, is Earth-like. So that's like on the order of billion trillion Earth-like planets. And God is in all of it. See what I mean? It's like that is the day's work for him. It's just, and so, you know, it's like, for what in reality, was put together by a number of scholars over centuries, and is now in the translations of it. We have, according to Christian scholar friends of mine, there's just all kinds of complications about where that came from and what it means. And I know myself, I know enough about the Bible to know I don't know much about the Bible. And that's my honest experience. Now I know lots of other people, and you do too, who feel like they know all about the Bible. They can tell you, right? And it's I think that kind of, for so many of people like that, I think use the Bible as a sort of blockade or shield from having a personal relationship with God, you know. And so that statement creates what you call cognitive dissonance. Two things that you seem to know come into conflict. But if you think it through, what other conclusion can you reach? All right, this instrument and exists in various versions around the world, and that it had the historical origin that it did. And now think of that process in comparison with God. And I say God is bigger than the Bible. And the fact is that um, uh, many people I know have had a profound and just wonderful spiritual and love life relationship with the Bible, or, guided by the Bible. And then there's other people I know who just know very little, including a lot of the people who think they know a lot. Because, from what little I know, I mean, I'm genuinely curious. Like these people come up to me, it's all right, it says in the Bible. Well, and well, then I ask another question, which is, and then obviously they don't know what they're talking about. And so that is a psychological process that is, it's troubling to them, but they don't know it. The troubling aspect of it to them shows in their hostility to us. And so that's why I don't call myself a Christian. I'll just be honest. I hear so much hostility. Are you a Christian? It's like, are you Christian? And it means an accusation of sure you're not. You're going to find some disagreement and you're going to hell. And that's the attitude that often comes out. What I say is, I'm a follower of Christ. Yeah. And so, and a big thing that distinguishes people is some people are just terrified to say, I don't know. And I'm just easy saying, I don't know. And I just, it never, to me, it's just an absurdity to say, or to think that God is punishing me because I don't know. And, or, but some people, they're terrified. And I have this, friend who's a minister, and I was walking along with him. I said, just a minute, Rick. I said, you don't have to pass a theology exam. Uh, but see, from his training, that's what he thought is the key. That, oh no, what? All right, you're coming in. All right, what is in Psalms 4? Quote the third line. And that is just stupid and insane. But it is understandable in that so many people are terrified of saying, I don't. But to me, I give my ignorance over to God in a way, and I'm working on it myself. And I asked for years. I've had this policy with books. I used to just books all over the place. I'd start one. Oh, this, and but 15, 20 years ago, I decided on a strict policy. Never will I read. Stop reading one book. And that means that I have to really formulate. Think about this. And I say, well, God guide me. And that seems pretty inane or stupid for somebody to ask God to tell him what book he reads. But it just works out in the most amazing way. I mean, I don't know why you saw this in the New York Times or you saw it in the bookshelf, or somebody gives it to you and you decide commit to reading it. And it's just, oh my God, that it connects with what you're interested in at that time.
Well, and I'll say, Raymond, and really the thing that connected me to your work and having conversations with you is not unlike you talking to so many people who've had near death experiences or afterlife encounters, as you might describe them. And I can say some of those experiences have stretched me very much theologically in that it gets into the gray area that's outside of a lot of our traditional theology, and
Yeah.
you really have to wrestle with a whole bunch of new stuff that you maybe didn't have to process before. From a Christian perspective, I would want to come at afterlife experiences, near death experiences, and say, I want to process that in light of what I read in scripture. From your perspective, is it helpful to process the near death experience in the light of the Bible, or is that a hindrance? I'd be curious to get your perspective on that.
Well, I don't think there's very much in the Bible that pertains to near death experiences except obliquely. Um, I have I've been an absorber of this. I just watch and heard thousands of these things. And it gradually dawns on you that you can't think your way out of it. It's, I am a skeptic, actually, in the real sense of Greek philosophy. The skeptics were a movement that, after the development of logic, thought about and if you think about logic, it's a machine for generating conclusions, right? And so they knew how to do it. Aristotle showed us how to do that. It works very well. Then 30 years later, the skeptics came along. They learned it thoroughly. They knew the practice. And so then Pyrrho thought, this was his thought, well, what if we we really apply this system rigorously and we ask every detail, we think it on. But then in the end, our technique is to avoid drawing. And what would happen? They did it as a spiritual practice. And they found two things, as I have. That number one, it opens your mind in a very fascinating new way. I mean, it's indescribable. I've been thinking like this since literally I was a kid. And I like the way it's brought my mind. And then also, if you think of it geometrically, like a conclusion, everybody's moving this way to get to the conclusion. But your technique is to, deflect from the conclusion. Then you're going to see things in your peripheral vision that everybody has missed. And that's happened to me many times. And so, but just like rigorously applying that practice for decades and applying it to the question of life after death. I realized that you can't draw a logical conclusion, but it's basically, I give up. I can't think my way out of it. It's like people want to say, oh, it's the brain damage or the oxygen deprivation. Well, as you and I both know, it's very common for people who are at the bedside, relatives, friends, caretakers, passersby will sometimes empathically experience these same things. They say they see apparitions gather around the dying person. They feel themselves leaving their body. They see the environment filled with light. Many of them, I don't know how many, but it's a small percentage, but it's many in toto, empathically experience the dying life review of the person's story. So to me, that doesn't mean that this is oxygen deprivation to the brain.
Yeah, if it was only based on oxygen deprivation to the brain, it doesn't make any sense for other folks to kind of co-experience or experience that along with the person that is dying. And I'll say too, like I try to read broadly in this space. I mean, I've read a lot of books and have contributed to books that come at this from a Christian perspective, but I also enjoy reading books from people who come at it from all kinds of different perspectives, more so from really my reasoning for that is they pick up on nuances and things that I just don't see because I'm processing through a traditionally Christian worldview often, and the things that they'll pull out or just kind of the different beats and rhythms of these experiences, it stretches me, but at the same time, like I would have never thought to look at it that way if I only came at it from my one perspective. So for me, reading broadly in this space has been extremely helpful.
Yeah, me too. I just, it's just great. It's once you get interested passionately in one thing, eventually in life, you're going to be interested in everything. I mean, that's not, I just, whew, I mean, I've read 185 books in the last year, Shaun, academic books. And I get thank God for that too. God has granted me access to this vast number of books full of these astonishing information and knowledge. And that I, Raymond Moody, 78 years old, could sit here, thanks to God, and to, e- exist in a bounty of knowledge with instant access to it. And that's fun. Recently, my, I like Bernard of Clairvaux, if you've probably heard of him, and one of his things he said was, some seek to know for the sake of knowledge, and that is curiosity. Some seek to know to be known and praised themselves, and that is vanity. And some seek knowledge to help others, and that is law. Now, I've never been in the middle group because, I mean, I'm vain in many ways, I'm sure, but not this way that I think I know things. I mean, to me, it's obvious that I know almost anything. I don't know almost anything. And, when you're an astronomer, you see that, right? And then, but I am started out in curiosity, the first group. And I mean, I just love knowledge for the sake of knowledge and still do. But that third part is now dawned me too. It's like George Ritchie had that exquisitely. He had lots, he was just constantly seeking, but it was all the things he was learning. It was stuff he thought he could use to help people. And so I, that's where I am now. I'm beginning to see that part of it too, but I can't, I'm sorry. I seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Is just, I can't help doing it. And I thank God I leaped over that second part, but now I'm seeing more and more of the third type.
Well, and I can say based on my own experiences, I'm about half your age, but like concepts of God, what kind of the worldview that develops in us. Like I say, it's always kind of a mix of like personal experiences, people you've met, that have impacted you, books we've encountered where we incorporate some of those ideas. Like for you, can you kind of define the mix of experience, people, and books that have kind of helped shape your worldview, if you will? If you look back, like what are the core things that stand out for you in terms of shaping your concept of God or worldview?
Something came into my mind. I was just learning to read. I was about 6 years old. And I quickly learned to read, but I was sitting on the floor reading a book. I don't remember what it was. And my dad, who was a doctor, was sitting up reading his medical book in the chair. And so I read that word philosophy, and I remember saying, "Dad, what is a philosopher?" And he went into this praise, just like, "Oh, they're wonderful men who seek knowledge and come up with wonderful, deep ideas." And that was my first, big, opening that. That was a big experience for me. Then the experiences of, of being an astronomer. I mean, it's just mind bending, and I sort of was mind bent all the way through grammar school, I guess, and high school, and then so those were kind of the experiential things. The people, there's been a lot of them. Obviously, no, without saying mom, dad, my grandparents, and so on. But George Ritchie was then a big, really big deal in my life. So he was the person who. Um, uh, and then what was the third one?
Books or ideas that
Oh,
have
books.
helped shape
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
a book that well, just to get down to the beginning of it, the first books that still persist with me. You're too young to remember Carl Barks, the Walt Disney comic books on Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge were written by this amazing artist named um, Carl Barks, and for 20 or 30 years. And everybody my age, including uh, uh, Spielberg and Lucas, it's just people. And when this guy would go to Germany, because after the war, Disney had sent the comics over there, so the German kids could read. So when Karl Barks would go to Germany, it was like the arrival of Elvis, and the police had to go. "Ah!" And he was kind of a national hero there. And there was a club called the Donald Duck Club in Germany. I read about it in the late 60s. And the requirements was that you had to have a doctoral degree and a complete or near complete collection of Donald Ducks, Karl Barks, Donald Ducks, and Uncle Scrooges. And so the New York Times was at one of their meetings, and the question they were debating at that time was, "Wo ist Duckburg?" Like, where is Duckburg? They had an American, and just where he had in mind. So and then also um, Plato's Phaedo. Now, I think it's so interesting. This is the real deal, and you can look this up. For example, the first I read it was in 1964 in Bertrand Russell's very reputable History of Western Philosophy. But also, I've over the years, it seems so extraordinary this statement, but I've asked over the years many scholars of religious studies, like professors of religious studies, have is that true? And they say, yeah, absolutely it is. But this was Bertrand Russell's statement. The Christians um, derived their theology of the afterlife from Plato's Phaedo. And that's the historical reality, see, because the Jewish thing, it didn't have much of a tradition on the afterlife, so when this came up, there is, and so, and that book just changed my life, Shaun. I was 18 when I read it. I think it was October of 62. I remember exactly when I was reading and the impressions I had. And what it's about is Plato's analysis of the prospect of a rational proof of an afterlife. And it's still the best thing ever done on the subject because all this stuff, this parapsychology, psychical research, that's just entertainment and play. It's nothing to that. But the Phaedo, that is real. And one of the things he said there was, at one point he said, philosophy is a rehearsal for dying. And my thought, wow, why don't I saw it immediately? Which seems now at age 78 very strange. Why would an 18-year-old have that reaction? But I can say, what happened? Just before I came to college, I worked my work I did reading in my parents' basement, right? And right above me was my sister's stereo. And so I'm trying to read. And so I had to put earplugs in to read. And that was frustrating to me. And then just a few months later, I replayed those things. Yeah, we philosophers, we have to try to get away from things or exclude the senses to do our thinking. And so it's so frustrating. Then he said, philosophy is a rehearsal for dying. And I got it. See, it just because it's so true. If you think about death constantly and meditate on it, muse on it, then when it comes, there's a natural life process of going through it and coming to terms with it. Yeah, and I pray, I thank God every day, just like for all these things He's given me in my education and all. It just, I like what Plato said. He said this: if you really think about it, the human life is not a very serious thing. He said, we are God's toy. We are God's toys or playthings. And he said, and the best way to do this life is to sort of play at it. And that's the kind of thing that people say, as in different words, maybe, but when they have a near death experience, that it's not really as serious as it and exacting. God is not very exacting. He is exact, but he is not exacting, in my
Right.
experience of it.
Right. Right. Well, and it wouldn't be a conversation if we didn't somehow bring up Dr. Seuss, and you do touch on that in this book as well. How can Dr. Seuss equip us to better understand a God who's difficult for us to wrestle with without anthropomorphization? I mean, I feel like that's the struggle, and kind of in that same way as we've talked about in other conversations. When we talk about near-death experiences, we're trying to project stuff from our reality to wrestle with what is
Yeah.
a completely other experience. So, how can Dr. Seuss help us to kind of better step into that nonsense
Right.
category?
Oh, wait, this is interesting, Shaun. In the Bible, there are, in the New Old Testament, there are roughly 12, roughly a dozen abecedaries, most famously the 119th Psalm. And an abecedary is a document where you have the letters in alphabetical order, and each letter is associated with a different message or thing, right? Like A is for apple, B is for, and usually the one, and at the time of the Bible, see, that was a holy mode of literature. It was for communicating with God, and for expressing divine prophecies. And the point of the format is, on the one hand, you have the ironclad order of the alphabet, right? There's no surprise in that. And then on the other hand, you have the continuing element of surprises, what's going to be associated with the next letter. And so that is a psychologically irresistible structure of thought, as you can tell by going down to Barnes and Noble and count the number of ABC books, right? In the old days, they were a holy form of literature. Now they've become a device for teaching our kids their ABCs, an entertaining way. So it's kind of entertainment. And they are, I got 100 of them. I don't buy just any, I buy the artsy ones. You just amazing works of art. Okay, now, one of my favorite obituaries is written by Dr. Seuss. And it's called On Beyond Zebra, right? The normal ABC often ends at zebra, but Dr. Seuss is On Beyond Zebra. And one of the first parts of it, he says, in the places I go, there are things that I see that I never could spell if I stopped with the Z. I'm telling you this because you're one of my friends. My alphabet starts where your alphabet ends. And it's like, that is just, to me, an amazing piece of work. And it is clearly transdimensional. I mean, he's talking about, this other world is beyond our alphabet.
And I think we may have covered this in some of our previous interviews, but you've been wrestling with and talking about near death experiences longer than most of the rest of us at this point. In terms of God in the afterlife, I feel like so many of us want to come at you and say, "Hey, you're the father of this near death experience space. Just solve this for us. This question of God in the afterlife." And where people want to project their stuff on top of your work, like how on this side of your work and your journey, like how, do you still feel the same way about that you did in those first couple of decades?
Well, I don't think the God of the afterlife logically or necessarily go together. I mean, I guess there are other systems that don't think of a God and so on, but in my experience, it's integrated, but it's also God transcends this level of experience that we're in now. And I gather from all the thousands of people I've talked to and sort of probed about this is that God is more immediately present in the afterlife, that God still transcends the afterlife. That there's just a more accessibility and immediacy to it. Is what this is not words to anybody in particular. It's just what I summarize or paraphrase from hundreds and hundreds.
Well, and that's one of the things that's been so fascinating to me, meeting so many different people, some who they had their afterlife experience 3 months ago, 6 months ago, others who are multiple decades down the road. On average, it seems to take about 5 to 7 years for them to really wrestle with and unpack a lot of what they've experienced. Yet, I know people, they're 15 years out and they're understanding things about their experience that they just didn't know what to do with until last week. All of a sudden they got this revelation, or for some reason it clicked. It almost seems like the longer people get to sit with their experience, there's this unfolding understanding. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but their grasp of it seems to expand over time.
Yeah, it's William James in Varieties of Religious Experience sort of observed that there's at least two varieties of the spiritual path. That for seemingly most of us, it's like this, ups and downs, right? And then he said, for some of us, it's just like zip, right? It's like one day, yeah, the next day. And, I guess the near-death experience that strikes me, it's like the first, that type would be, for example, a mystical experience out in the woods, right? So And so, but then the near death experience constitutes to me, Shaun, a third type. Think about it, it's a combined type because, yes, they get the zip, right? And then it gets forward and it's just a gradual ascent. It's like, as people tell me, I'm sure it's like George said one time, said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And I can translate that into street terms, which means that means that, as we all know, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And see, that doesn't go away. But it's more, unsettling to you because you have the contrast of the what you experienced and so it's like that's what happens to be generally to people in your death experience, just like you're describing. They zip up, and then it's afterward throughout the rest of their life it's sort of it climbing up and yeah.
Well, and if you had to sum it up, and you go so many different places in this book, for somebody who reads God is bigger than the Bible, like what's that impact? What's that takeaway you hope somebody grasps or has to wrestle with when they encounter the book?
Yeah, I just I get a lot of folks who come to me who it's they are not really satisfied with organized religion, whatever. I mean, just like people turned off about it, but they're fine trying to find God. I don't want to have to, go through this ideology train. What can I? And so many people came to me with that yeah, that's why I wrote this book. And I just it was like, and I just lots of people have over the last couple of months. I've got, I guess, technically 10 or 15 communications from this folks who um, usually midlife, and they have been, from their point of view, turned off and battered by some sort of extreme religious training or something, and walked away from it. But still, God keeps coming up. So they're trying to find God without having to go all through this other rigmarole. And that's really, I wrote it for anybody who thinks it's interesting, but that was the specific stimulus for me to write it, was these folks. And there's been a wave of lately who they don't want religion, but they love God. Incredibly, I've had this friend who was an Episcopal priest and now dead. He's elderly, but he's passed away now. So I can say, and he probably laugh at this too. We were at the seminar one time. It's to my utter astonishment. He said, I want religion without God. And I wasn't trying to be smart or, come back around. It just automatically said, I want God without religion. And I think many religions do keep people away from God. Yeah, I think. And and then others don't. I mean, it depends on the person, but some people use it as a guide. But I personally don't think God cares whether we join a religion. Because I've talked to him for years. I mean, con- constantly, sometimes several times daily, constantly. And he has never said a word to me about religion. Right? Now, if I think he was interested in me being religious, he would have done something. But we continue to have good terms, talk, and have fun. And I just, it's, I'm from the deep South, and when I first got to know my wife about 30 years ago, we were sitting at the beach, not the harbor, one day at a restaurant eating. It was on a Sunday. And this a friend of my wife's came up, a lady who was also in broadcasting. And so she had a little baby. And so, and Cheryl, not trying to be, raising a point or anything, but just curious, she said, because she knew that's all what woman always went to church. Oh, you're not in the church today. And the woman, of course, kept, nervous and agitated and, defensive. Oh, well, since she came, She can't. Hard for us to do it. And I said, yeah, I know what you mean. We had to stop going to church when ours were at that age too, because they were afraid of snakes. And and it's and not that there's anything bad about snakes. I mean, I think the folks who put their life at the hands of a rattler, because on a spiritual quest, I don't imagine God, thinks anything bad about that. I mean, you're going to die from something, you know. um, yeah. So in it, surely I know something. No, I mean, I'm from you know, Lauderdale, Georgia, and we had friends who handled snakes and all, and in the speaking in tongues is even more so. I mean, that is a profound spiritual experience. You you just you don't have to be in a religious ceremony. You don't have to be in an ecstatic state. You just, even in privacy, like as a form of prayer, you can just start doing it. And you don't need to be in an ecstatic state to do it, but just within, time sort of disappears, but within a little while, you just enter into this amazing spiritual ecstatic state. And I can easily imagine from my own experience, for somebody who hasn't got to know God yet, that the experience might open up something that would be a good point to contact. So I'm not against religion. I'm saying that God doesn't care whether I have or anybody has a religion. He's working on a different, uh, you know.
Well, and I love Raymond how you're kind of willing to tackle sort of some of the sacred cows head on, if you will, and I always love your kind of nuanced responses because it is something we really need to wrestle with where um the idea of having a one-on-one relationship with God can feel scary versus it can be easier just to be steeped in religious practices and just very committed to those and not knowing God at all. Like that,
And he's trying to sort of, stay out of his view or something, or
right.
watching out for whether his recording instrument there this time you accidentally dropped the wafer. I mean, whatever it is. I mean, I've done some gosh awful things to people. I just don't, Shaun, decades ago, over quite a long period of time, I was very mean to somebody. And because of ego, right? I was, oh my God, I've been injured. And so I got back. And then that stopped. And then fast forward about 20 or 30 years, 20 years, I found myself, oh my God, I'm in the same situation now on the other side. And not only that, I quickly realized that my tormentor was 10 times as good at it as I was. Right. And I thought, yeah, I get it, because it has to be magnified to engage your attention. Right. And so the whole way through, some people, was God punishing me? No way. God was educating me. And the whole time I was through this, thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Because how can you understand what you did wrong unless you experience it from the other um, face of it, right? You know,
Well, Raymond, thank you again for a fascinating conversation. Like all of your books, God is Bigger Than the Bible challenged me. I find your work is the kind of work I probably have to read through two or three times to really wrestle with it. Because go through it the first time and I'll wrestle with some things and then be like, I don't know if I fully understand that. So like it's just yeah, your work really sharpens me. So thank you for that. Not
thank you.
everything I read does, but your work always has.
Thank you. I have that same experience. See, with it's like you or at you have a point of view and generosity. Generously uh, curious and receptive and fun to be with, and that's just delightful for me. So, it really it helps me get oriented to see the area that you are focused around, and at the same time, even as I've known you, I've seen it. It's widening. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Raymond. Truly, truly my honor. God is bigger than the Bible. All of Raymond's other books, easy to find wherever great books are sold. And Raymond, I just appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Sean. Thank you so much, friend.